When Walter and I arrived to visit my in-laws, my mother-in-law, who had come to pick us up from the airport, greeted us with a cold stare and said, "You can't ride in the car. You'll have to walk home." She dismissed us with a haughty sniff. The journey home was 3 hours on foot, far beyond what I was prepared for. Though unconfident in my physical abilities, this treatment felt like too much. I was on the verge of tears when someone stepped in to help us. In the end, it was my mother-in-law who felt the sting of regret. "My name is Jennifer. I'm 30 years old and happily married to Walter, who is 2 years younger than me. We met in college through the mountain club, where I fell for his charm and good looks. Walter is not only handsome but also quite popular with women, so I wondered why he chose me. Walter once told me, 'Jennifer is steadfast and quiet even on the toughest climbs, and I admire that about her.' Walter works for a prestigious corporation and earns a substantial salary. Since our marriage, our life together has been as joyful as our college days. However, there's one thing that nags at me." During dinner, Walter's phone rang. "Oh, it's Mom. Excuse me, I need to take this," he said, rushing out of the room. His mother calls him frequently, about every other day. She seems to dote on her exceptional son, and Walter is always attentive to her, which sometimes makes me wonder if he's a bit of a mama's boy. But given how much she invested in raising him, I try to be understanding and value her place in his life. However, our feelings seem to diverge. It became clear before our marriage, during our first visit to my in-laws. "Humph, Jennifer is 2 years older than my son, nearly 30. How quaint," my mother-in-law remarked, clearly displeased by having an older daughter-in-law. Her dissatisfaction was evident throughout our visit. My father-in-law, trying to smooth things over, said, "It's fine. Love conquers all. Jennifer seems dependable and is perfect for Walter, who has his own vulnerabilities." But his words only seemed to aggravate her further. Unable to confront my father-in-law directly, my mother-in-law chose to take out her frustration on me in subtle ways. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry, Jennifer. It seems the snacks I prepared have gone bad. I'll get some fresh ones for you," she said, her eyes widening, lips curling in a disapproving twist. Over time, I became adept at reading her subtle signs of discontent. "It's okay, really. I can manage," I replied with a smile, cutting away the spoiled part of the dried fruit and eating what was left. My time in the mountain club had taught me to make do with what I had. Father-in-law and Walter chuckled. "That's just like Jennifer," they said, with my father-in-law adding, "Honey, that's not good. Don't serve Jennifer anything like that." Although the mood remained light, I couldn't ignore her fleeting, sharp glance and the click of her tongue. Other instances followed. When she mentioned, "I went to Italy last week and brought back souvenirs," she proudly presented a high-end branded tie for Walter. For me, she handed a flimsy t-shirt with a cheap-looking logo, clearly a knockoff. "Come on, try on the tie, Jennifer. You should try on the shirt too," my mother-in-law said with that familiar, disdainful expression on her face. It was clear this was another instance of her subtle harassment. No, I can't really wear a tie with casual clothes, and I'm not up for it right now," I replied, forcing a smile to keep things light. Inside, I was seething. Afterward, I only used that t-shirt for mundane tasks like weeding in the summer, or as a joke to show friends in photos. I loathed even looking at it. The harassment was always subtle, noticeable only to me. Whenever I mentioned it to Walter, he'd brush it off with, "Mom's a bit quirky. Just overlook it." But the constant undercurrent of malice gradually wore me down. Our town was about an hour's drive from my in-laws' place, which made their proximity a constant source of unease. Then one day, Walter came to me with unexpected news. "Jennifer, I'm sorry to spring this on you, but I've been transferred. The move starts next month, so please start preparing." Walter's transfer was sudden, but I felt a secret sense of relief. It was a perfect opportunity to distance ourselves from my in-laws. Moreover, the new location was very close to my parents' home, making the transition from feeling distant to feeling like coming home. "Got it. I'll handle the preparations and ask my family for help too," I replied cheerfully, eager to escape my mother-in-law's petty harassment. Though I was apprehensive about our new life, the overwhelming sense of liberation from her nagging took up most of my heart. The move was completed, and I thought I finally put some distance between myself and my mother-in-law. However, that hope was short-lived. One day, I received another call from her. "Hello, Jennifer. Where have you been? Ignoring my calls?" You're not neglecting my son while spending all your time at your parents' house, are you? I wanted to respond with something biting but held back. I'm sorry I missed your call earlier. I was in line at the checkout. Walter might be feeling a bit overwhelmed in this new environment, so I'm focusing on supporting him with nutritious meals. Soon, her calls came every 2 days. Although our face-to-face interactions were fewer, our conversations became more frequent, mostly dominated by her snide remarks. My son is sensitive. I wonder if someone as thick-skinned as you can truly understand him. His high school girlfriend was delicate and fragile, but his tastes have certainly changed, hasn't it? She would say, making me uncomfortable with every comment. It felt as though I had become her personal stress outlet, a trash can for her frustrations. The most painful comments were about children. Jennifer, you're 30 now. What are your thoughts on having children? Do you think someone older than my son can have a normal child? I was stunned by her outdated and insensitive remarks. Although this had been a concern of mine lately, hearing it directly from her left me in tears after I hung up. What does my mother-in-law think of me? Does she believe I'm immune to her hurtful comments? After our move, the frequency of her calls increased dramatically. I began responding with only safe, non-confrontational answers to avoid provoking her further. Eventually, she seemed to lose interest and the calls dwindled. I felt a profound sense of relief. Then, on New Year's Day the following year, Walter and I traveled to my in-laws' house. They had come to pick us up from the airport. Hey Walter, Jennifer, it's been a while. Father-in-law greeted us warmly, waving enthusiastically. Despite my anxiety about facing my mother-in-law, father-in-law's friendliness was a comforting contrast. Happy New Year, Mom and Dad. It's great to see you both. Happy New Year, Walter. It's nice to see you. I managed, though my eyes were nervously scanning for any sign of my mother-in-law. Mother-in-law barely glanced at me, which I took as a sign of lingering irritation over my previous responses to her calls. The atmosphere was awkward, and I was contemplating how to navigate the situation. You must be tired after the journey. How about we relax at the airport cafe for a bit? Father-in-law suggested cheerfully, seemingly unaware of the tension between my mother-in-law and me. Oh, that's a great idea. Isn't there a cafe on the second floor? Walter responded enthusiastically as we made our way to the cafe inside the airport. Should I drive back? Father-in-law asked. No need, I'm still driving, Walter replied, and the men continued their lively conversation while mother-in-law and I sat in silence. After ordering, I stood up and said, "Excuse me, I'm going to the restroom." "Oh, maybe I'll go too," mother-in-law said, rising to follow me. A sinking feeling took hold of me as we walked toward the women's restroom. Just as we approached, mother-in-law, trailing behind, remarked, "You can't ride in the car, so why don't you walk back?" Confused, I turned to look at her, only to see that familiar, disdainful expression on her face. "We're heading back as a family of 3. You're just a stranger, aren't you?" I was stunned. Walk back from here to my in-laws' house. How far could that be? I was in shock, especially at being called a stranger by my own mother-in-law. Mother-in-law continued to hurl her harsh words at me, leaving me feeling both hurt and disbelieving. "I frequently called you, trying to stay connected, but unlike Walter, your responses were always so cold. Living so close to your parents has clearly affected you. I can't see you as my daughter-in-law anymore. You feel like a stranger to me." My mother-in-law's voice grew louder and I was taken aback. I didn't want to argue in public, so I quietly replied, "Yes, I understand." I didn't feel like returning to where Walter and my father-in-law were, so I made my way to the airport exit, deep in thought. Despite her insistence that I walk back, this was an airport. There must be taxis or buses available. I could take one as far as possible and then walk the rest of the way. But more than that, I was preoccupied with the thought of how I would face my in-laws after arriving on foot. What would those days at their house be like? That weighed heavily on my mind. I checked my phone for transportation options to my in-laws' house. A bus was departing in just 10 minutes, but it wouldn't take me close to their home, so I would still need to walk for about 3 hours. 3 hours. I could manage that with my mountain climbing stamina, but there's a big difference between hiking for exercise and walking because I'm being pushed away. Tears began to well up in my eyes. Was it my fault? If I had been more pleasant on the phone, despite the harsh words, would things have turned out differently? Lost in thought, I was startled when someone tapped me on the shoulder from behind. "Jennifer, Why are you out here walking? It was my father-in-law's voice, gentle yet concerned. I saw you and my wife talking at the restroom entrance, he explained. When I saw you start to leave, I followed. Seeing the kindness in his eyes made the tears I had been holding back flow freely down my cheeks. Jennifer, what happened? I decided to be honest with him. I told him exactly what my mother-in-law had said, and his anger was palpable. She said that to my son's wife. He was visibly upset. Then he said something unexpected. I'll walk with you, Jennifer. Without hesitation, father-in-law stepped in front of me and began walking. Father-in-law. Don't worry. I enjoy mountain climbing and used to hike with Walter when he was younger. A 3-hour walk is nothing. Indeed, his pace was steady and strong, surprising for a 62-year-old. Let's go. Music. Only didn't tell Walter we were leaving. Is that all right? I suddenly realized I had left in a rush, forgetting to inform Walter. He'll be fine. She'll probably convince him to wait. I'll give him a call. With that, father-in-law pulled out his phone and began texting my mother-in-law, informing her that he was walking back with me and that the car keys were in his bag. As we waited for the bus, father-in-law's phone rang. He answered with a voice that barely concealed his anger. It was clearly my mother-in-law on the other end. I heard what you said to Jennifer. If that's how it's going to be, I'm not taking the car either. I could hear my mother-in-law's frantic voice on the line trying to explain. That's not what I meant. She just wanted to walk for exercise. Her excuse was infuriating. I was more bewildered than angry. We'll discuss this when we get home, father-in-law said before ending the call and slipping his phone into his pocket. As father-in-law's phone was now unreachable, mine began ringing next. It's probably mother-in-law calling, father-in-law said, looking at me. What could she possibly want now? To tell us to take the car? I'm definitely not answering. I chose to ignore the call as well. Father-in-law and I boarded the bus in silence, and after we got off, we continued walking. This way is a shortcut, he said, leading the way. There's a bit of a slope here, but let's do our best. With father-in-law occasionally giving tips, it felt like we were on a mountain climbing expedition together. However, I hadn't planned on such a long walk today and was wearing regular boots. Father-in-law was in leather shoes, which I knew would be uncomfortable over the long distance. I hardly spoke, but I did ask once. Father-in-law, are your feet all right? Won't walking so far in those shoes be painful? Father-in-law glanced down at my boots and then at his own shoes. Looks like we're both in the same predicament. I can't believe she made you walk such a long distance in those shoes. He shook his head, a mix of frustration and sympathy in his expression. We both considered calling a taxi but chose not to, wanting to make a point to my mother-in-law. But Jennifer, you're quite resilient, walking such a long distance without a word of complaint. Walter must have admired that strength in you, father-in-law remarked. His words lifted my spirits a bit. We continued walking, stopping to buy drinks from vending machines and snacks from a grocery store to stay hydrated. After about 3 hours, as the sun began to set, we finally arrived at my in-laws' house. Their car was parked outside. Mother-in-law and Walter were home, father-in-law called out as he opened the front door. Walter hurried over, concern evident in his face. Jennifer, I was worried. Why did you decide to walk back? Did you hear that from Mom? That's not what happened. Mom told Jennifer to walk back, father-in-law explained, visibly tired as he took a seat near the entrance. Mother-in-law emerged from the living room, looking pale and flustered. No, that's not what I meant. There's been a misunderstanding. I couldn't hold back any longer. What misunderstanding? You told me, since you can't ride in the car, why don't you walk back, didn't you? I spoke the truth plainly. I hated lying, and the situation reminded me of my mountain climbing days. A 3-hour walk was indeed good exercise. Walter glanced at my mother-in-law, clearly knowing that I wasn't the type to lie. All eyes were now on her, father-in-law's, Walter's, and mine. What? You trust this woman over me? We're done. You side with a stranger instead of your own family. Mother-in-law's voice was filled with rage. So, I wasn't allowed in the car because I'm a stranger? I asked quietly. Mom, I can't believe you treat Jennifer this way. She's a crucial part of my family, and I wanted you to accept her, Walter said, his voice tight with anger. His clenched fists shook as he spoke. If you're going to treat Jennifer like this, I'm done with you, Mom. I won't take your calls anymore. Don't contact Jennifer either. Walter took my hand firmly and said, "Let's go." "Walter, wait." Without another word, Walter slammed the door behind him and led me away, not looking back. A year later. "Hey Jennifer, Walter, come over here. The view is amazing." Walter, father-in-law, and I were out mountain climbing together. 6 months after the incident, Walter had received a transfer, and we had moved back to our old home. After the New Year's confrontation, father-in-law decided to get a divorce and move to a place near our house. Now, climbing together on weekends had become a cherished routine. "How about we have lunch here?" he suggested as we reached the summit. We eagerly started preparing our meal. As we worked, father-in-law began to speak. "Mom went on a spending spree after the divorce. Even though the property division was fair, she's already in financial trouble. I suppose she might have been feeling lonely. The divorce was hard on her. Lots of tears and shouting. It's probably best for us to have some distance right now. She needs to expand her world. Otherwise, she tends to take her stress out on those closest to her." I listened quietly, absorbing the conversation. "I'll cherish my own world so I don't end up taking my stress out on others," Walter said, his voice resolute. As I looked out at the breathtaking view with my beloved family, I made that resolution in my heart.